The sun hovered low on the horizon, casting an amber glow over the quiet outskirts of a small Midwestern town. The retro diner parking lot buzzed with life, a sanctuary for bikers and car enthusiasts. Classic Chevrolets and Cadillacs gleamed under the golden light, their chrome surfaces reflecting flashes of the neon jukebox sign that blinked steadily from the diner's rooftop. The smoky scent of freshly grilled burgers intermingled with the sharp tang of motor oil and leather, creating an atmosphere that was both inviting and gritty. It was Sunday evening, and for the locals, this was the pinnacle of their week, a ritual gathering to celebrate engines, speed, and camaraderie. The Road Stallions, a motorcycle club renowned across the state, had transformed the lot into a showcase of mechanical power and artistry. Riders adjusted their gleaming Harleys while trading jokes and stories that echoed in bursts of laughter. A makeshift audience of curious onlookers lined the edges of the lot, sipping sodas or snapping photos on their phones. Children pressed their noses to the diner's glass windows, eyes wide with wonder as they watched the motorcycles roar to life in brief, playful revs. It was a spectacle both ordinary and electric, a space where personalities clashed and united under the shared love of the open road. Kevin and Greg, two younger members of the club, reveled in their own brand of entertainment, flaunting their customized Harleys as if they were extensions of themselves. Kevin's ride was an aggressive matte black, while Greg's bike flaunted flames painted across the tank, the kind of design that demanded attention. The duo barked loud jokes, their voices cutting through the general chatter. "You think anyone here can even come close?" Kevin jeered, nudging Greg with his elbow. "Doubt it," Greg replied, smirking. "I bet Liz's bike is the only thing worth worrying about tonight." Liz, a veteran of the Road Stallions and widely respected for her skill, stood apart, methodically inspecting her bike. Dressed in sleek black leather, her sharp gaze scanned her tires and checked her gear with mechanical precision. Unlike Kevin and Greg, Liz had no interest in drawing attention. Her presence alone commanded it. As the evening edged closer to the informal stunt contest, an unfamiliar figure entered the scene, shifting the mood like a sudden chill in the air. An elderly man shuffled cautiously into the lot, his tattered coat hanging loosely from bony shoulders. His face was hidden beneath a mess of unkempt gray hair and a beard streaked with grime. A worn baseball cap dangled from his fingers, and his boots, scuffed and mismatched, whispered against the asphalt with every step. For a moment, he seemed part of the background, a drifter passing through, blending in with the quiet shadows beyond the neon's reach. But then, he didn't just pass through. He stopped. The man's movements were slow, deliberate, his head turning as if to take in every detail of the gathering. The murmur of voices around him shifted into hushed whispers, punctuated by restrained laughter. It wasn't long before the more boisterous members of the group took notice. "Hey, check this out," Greg said loudly, tilting his chin in the man's direction. "We've got company. Guess Grandpa forgot his invitation." Kevin crossed his arms, eyes narrowing as he studied the intruder. "What's he even doing here? This isn't some charity cookout." Their remarks drew chuckles from the surrounding group. Liz glanced up from her bike but said nothing, her expression unreadable. The elderly man seemed oblivious to the growing attention, his gaze now fixed on a particular motorcycle parked near the center of the lot, a pristine Harley Road King, its chrome surface gleaming like a jewel under the fading sunlight. Greg, emboldened by the man's apparent vulnerability, strode toward him with exaggerated confidence. "Hey, old-timer. You looking for a bus stop or something? This isn't exactly your scene." The man paused and turned to face Greg, revealing piercing blue eyes that stood out sharply against his weathered face. For a fleeting moment, the two locked gazes, and something in the man's eyes gave Greg pause. There was a depth, a quiet defiance that seemed out of place for someone in such disheveled condition. Greg faltered, but only briefly. "You hear me?" Greg pressed, his voice tinged with irritation now. "This isn't a museum. Move along." Kevin joined in, his voice laced with mockery. "Come on, give him a break. Maybe he's here to trade in that walking stick for some horsepower." The laughter swelled around them, cruel and unrelenting. The man remained silent, his gaze unwavering, as though he hadn't heard a word of it. He turned back toward the Road King, studying it with the intensity of an artist admiring a masterpiece. It was Liz who finally broke the tension, her voice cutting through the laughter. "That's enough, you two." Her tone was calm but carried the weight of authority. "Let the guy look. He's not hurting anyone." Greg rolled his eyes but stepped back. "Whatever you say, Liz. Your circus, your rules." The man nodded subtly in Liz's direction, a faint acknowledgement, before stepping closer to the Harley. The onlookers watched with a mix of curiosity and disbelief as he reached out, his hand hovering just above the bike's handlebar. A collective gasp rippled through the group when his fingers finally made contact. It was a breach of unspoken protocol, a stranger, uninvited, daring to touch a machine so lovingly maintained. Greg looked ready to explode, his fists clenching at his sides. "Okay, that's it," he spat, storming forward again. "You've had your fun, Grandpa. Step away before I make you." But before Greg could reach him, the old man moved. With a fluidity that seemed almost unnatural for his age, he swung a leg over the Harley and settled into the seat. The move was so seamless, so practiced, that it stunned the crowd into silence. Greg stopped dead in his tracks, his jaw slack. The man gripped the handlebars with familiarity, his posture transforming. His slouched shoulders straightened, and the frailty that had marked his every step seemed to evaporate. In its place was a quiet, commanding presence. He turned the ignition key, and the Harley roared to life, its engine growling with feral intensity. The sound shattered the stunned quiet, reverberating through the lot and demanding attention. He twisted the throttle, letting the engine roar louder, as if issuing a challenge that needed no words. Kevin and Greg stood frozen, their earlier bravado replaced by confusion and a flicker of unease. Even Liz, normally unshakable, looked genuinely intrigued. The man's eyes swept over the crowd, lingering briefly on each face, before fixing on Greg one last time. There was no malice in his gaze, only a quiet determination. And then, with a final twist of the throttle, he smiled. Not wide, not smug, but enough to reveal a man who knew exactly what he was doing. A hush fell over the parking lot. The stage was his. The Harley's engine roared like a beast awakened from slumber, its growl vibrating through the parking lot and drawing every eye to the spectacle unfolding. The old man, his hand steady on the handlebars, seemed utterly unbothered by the crowd's shock. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with disbelief, irritation, and a growing sense of challenge. Greg, whose bravado moments earlier had been unshakable, now stood rigid, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Greg barked, his voice cracking slightly as he stormed toward the man. "Get off that bike. Now." The old man didn't move. He let the Harley purr under him, the rhythmic rumble filling the silence like a slow drumbeat. His piercing blue eyes, sharp and unyielding, fixed on Greg as if weighing his worth. A beat passed, and the man finally spoke, his voice low but carrying an undeniable edge. "This machine isn't just metal and wheels, son. It's spirit. And spirit doesn't bow to bullies." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. A few members of the crowd exchanged glances, their earlier snickers fading into a hesitant quiet. Even Kevin, who had been quick to mock, found himself shifting uncomfortably. Liz crossed her arms, her sharp gaze flicking between the old man and Greg. She didn't intervene, not yet. There was a certain gravity in the situation that demanded its natural course. Greg scoffed, though his bravado faltered. "Big talk for someone who looks like they crawled out of a dumpster," he shot back, but his voice lacked its earlier venom. "You think you can just show up here and, what? Prove something? Win some respect? You're out of your depth, old man." The old man smirked, a subtle, knowing curve of his lips that made Greg's fists clench at his sides. Slowly, deliberately, the man revved the engine, sending a wave of sound that seemed to ripple through the gathering. It wasn't just noise, it was a statement. "Respect isn't given," the old man said evenly. "It's earned. And sometimes, it's taken." Kevin stepped forward now, emboldened by Greg's frustration. "All right, enough of this. You're making a fool of yourself, Grandpa." Just step off the bike before you embarrass yourself any further." The old man turned his gaze to Kevin, the smirk fading into something colder, sharper. "Embarrassment isn't mine to feel tonight," he replied. He twisted the throttle again, letting the engine roar louder. "But you two, you might want to brace yourselves." The tension reached a breaking point. Greg, unable to hold back any longer, lunged forward, his arm outstretched to yank the man off the bike. But before he could reach, the old man acted. With a sudden twist of the throttle, the Harley leaped forward, the tires screeching against the asphalt as the machine surged ahead. Greg stumbled back, caught off guard, his curses drowned by the thunderous roar of the bike. The crowd gasped as the Harley roared in a tight circle, its rider weaving effortlessly around the parked vehicles and stunned onlookers. The old man moved with a fluidity that defied his age, leaning into the curves with the grace of a dancer and the precision of a veteran racer. The sight was mesmerizing, an unexpected, unspoken challenge come to life. Liz's eyes narrowed as she watched, her mind racing. This wasn't just some washed-up drifter who got lucky. The way he handled the bike, the confidence in his movements, it all pointed to something far more complex. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was a story behind this man, one that none of them could yet grasp. Greg, meanwhile, was livid. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, but his voice barely carried over the sound of the Harley's engine. "You think this is funny?" The old man didn't answer. Instead, he brought the bike to a sudden stop, the rear tire kicking up a small cloud of dust as it skidded into place. He dismounted with an ease that belied his weathered frame, his boots landing firmly on the ground. For a moment, he stood there, letting the silence stretch out as the crowd watched, transfixed. Greg took a step forward, but Liz's voice cut through the air. "Don't," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. Greg froze, glaring at her in disbelief. "You're just going to let him?" "Shut up, Greg," she snapped, her eyes never leaving the old man. "Let's see where this goes." The man's blue eyes scanned the crowd again, his gaze pausing briefly on each face. There was no malice in his expression, only a quiet defiance. Slowly, he raised his hand and gestured toward the motorcycles lined up for the evening's informal competition. "Show me what you've got," he said, his voice carrying an edge of challenge. "If you're half as good as you claim, prove it." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Kevin and Greg exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence shaken. The crowd murmured, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. This wasn't how the evening was supposed to go. Liz stepped forward now, her expression unreadable. She studied the old man for a long moment, her sharp mind working through the implications. Finally, she spoke, her tone even but carrying the weight of her position in the group. "Who are you?" she asked. "And why are you really here?" The man met her gaze, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, or memory. "I'm no one important," he said quietly. "Just a man who knows a thing or two about riding." Liz tilted her head, her skepticism evident, but she didn't press further. She turned to the others. "You want to shut him up? Get on your bikes and do it the right way." The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and jeers, the tension breaking into a charged excitement. Kevin and Greg reluctantly moved toward their bikes, their pride outweighing their doubts. The old man stepped back, his expression calm but watchful. As the riders prepared, Liz approached the old man, her voice low. "This isn't just about showing off, is it?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the Harley, its engine still warm and humming softly. "Sometimes," he said finally, "you have to remind the world who you are, even if it doesn't want to remember." Liz frowned, but before she could say more, Kevin's bike roared to life, signaling the start of the impromptu contest. The old man stepped back, folding his arms as the scene unfolded. The stage was set, and though no one could say it aloud, they all felt the same thing: the night was about to change. The engines of the Harley-Davidsons roared to life, filling the parking lot with an intoxicating symphony of power and rebellion. A small cloud of dust kicked up as Kevin and Greg revved their bikes, their faces set in grim determination. This was no longer just about motorcycles or tricks. It had morphed into something primal, a battle of egos, a struggle for dominance. The crowd pressed closer, forming a loose circle around the makeshift arena, their excited chatter laced with tension. The old man stood at the edge of the lot, his arms crossed, watching with the calm intensity of someone who had nothing left to prove. His presence was magnetic, a stark contrast to the nervous energy that surrounded the younger riders. Liz leaned against her bike nearby, her expression unreadable as her eyes darted between the old man and the two challengers. Greg, his confidence rekindled by the adrenaline pumping through his veins, pointed at the man as he revved his engine. "You wanted a show, old man? Watch and learn." Kevin smirked, his fingers tightening on the handlebars. "We'll show him what real riding looks like." The signal to start was unspoken but understood. Greg shot forward first, his bike tearing across the asphalt with an aggressive burst of speed. He leaned sharply, pulling into a tight circle as he began a series of figure-8 maneuvers. His tires screeched against the pavement, leaving faint black marks as he pushed the limits of his bike's agility. The crowd cheered as Greg transitioned into a wheelie, holding the front tire aloft for several seconds before landing smoothly. Kevin followed suit, his approach more technical. He accelerated into a high-speed drift, the back tire sliding out as he controlled the angle with surgical precision. The bike straightened just before colliding with the edge of the lot, drawing gasps of approval from the onlookers. Not to be outdone, Kevin executed a sharp U-turn, then launched into a standing burnout, smoke curling from the rear tire as he held the throttle open. The competition escalated quickly, each rider trying to outdo the other with increasingly daring stunts. Greg pulled off a no-handed wheelie, his arms raised in mock triumph as the crowd roared. Kevin countered with a high-speed slalom through the parked cars, narrowly avoiding a collision more than once. The tension in the air was electric, every cheer and gasp adding to the charged atmosphere. But through it all, the old man remained motionless, his expression unchanged. His gaze was steady, unblinking, as if he were dissecting every move, every angle, every choice the younger riders made. Liz glanced at him once, her curiosity evident, but she kept her distance, choosing to observe rather than interfere. Greg, emboldened by the crowd's enthusiasm, finally skidded to a halt near the old man. He grinned, sweat glistening on his forehead. "What do you think, Grandpa? Still think you can keep up with that?" The old man's response was a quiet chuckle, low and dismissive. "Flashy. But that's not riding. That's a circus." The crowd fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a storm cloud. Greg's grin twisted into a scowl. Big talk for someone who hasn't done anything but stand there. Kevin rolled up beside Greg, his expression more wary than angry. "What's your deal, old man? You come here, you throw out challenges, and now you just stand there like some kind of judge. Either show us what you've got or get out." The old man's gaze shifted to Kevin, his piercing blue eyes sharp as ice. "You think riding is about tricks and noise? That's not the road. That's not what it means to be one with the machine." Liz, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, her voice cutting through the growing tension. "Then show us," she said, her tone a mix of challenge and curiosity. "If you're going to talk about what riding really is, prove it." The old man nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for those words. He stepped toward the Harley he had claimed earlier, his movements deliberate and measured. The crowd murmured, their curiosity rekindled as they watched him mount the bike with the same effortless grace he had shown before. He started the engine, and it roared to life with a sound that seemed deeper, more resonant than before. He sat still for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the handlebars, his eyes closed as if listening to the machine. Then, with a twist of the throttle, he launched forward. The Harley moved like a living thing, gliding across the asphalt with an elegance that defied its size and weight. The old man didn't just ride, he danced. He leaned into curves so tightly that his knees skimmed the ground, the bike responding to his every command as though it were an extension of his body. He didn't bother with tricks or theatrics. His performance was pure, a masterclass in control and connection. The crowd fell into an awed silence, their cheers forgotten as they watched him weave between the parked vehicles with unerring precision. He accelerated suddenly, pulling into a perfect circle that tightened with every pass until the bike seemed to spin on a single point. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he straightened out, the Harley shooting forward like a bullet. He didn't stop there. As he reached the edge of the lot, he leaned back, lifting the front tire off the ground in a wheelie that carried him the entire length of the parking lot. But even this wasn't about showing off, it was about the seamless harmony between man and machine. There was no hesitation, no faltering. Every move was deliberate, every motion a testament to decades of experience. When he finally brought the bike to a stop, the silence was deafening. The old man dismounted slowly, his movements as fluid as they had been when he started. He turned to face the crowd, his expression calm and unreadable. Greg and Kevin stood frozen, their earlier bravado shattered. Liz stared at the old man, her arms still crossed but her posture noticeably less rigid. The crowd, too stunned to cheer, exchanged glances as if trying to process what they had just witnessed. The old man took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling on Greg and Kevin. "Riding isn't about showing off," he said quietly. "It's about respect, for the road, for the machine, and for yourself. You want to be great? Start there." With that, he turned and began walking away, the Harley rumbling softly behind him. The crowd parted to let him pass, their faces a mix of awe and uncertainty. For the first time that evening, there were no jeers, no mockery. Only silence and the sound of the Harley's engine as it idled, a quiet reminder of the lesson the old man had just delivered. The echo of the old man's words lingered in the air, mingling with the low hum of the Harley's engine. He walked past the stunned crowd, his steps deliberate, every movement carrying a quiet authority. Conversations bubbled up in hushed tones as the spectators tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. No one had expected the night to unfold like this, and now the entire dynamic of the gathering had shifted. Liz's sharp gaze followed him as he moved toward the edge of the lot. She leaned against her bike, her mind working overtime to piece together the puzzle he presented. It wasn't just his skill that unsettled her, it was the familiarity of it, the way his every move spoke of years spent mastering the road. There was history here, something buried beneath the surface, and Liz's instincts told her it was worth uncovering. Meanwhile, Greg's humiliation boiled over. His face was red, his fists clenched, and his chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. "Who the hell does he think he is?" he snarled, glaring after the old man. "Just comes here, lectures us, and walks away like he's some kind of legend." Kevin placed a hand on Greg's shoulder, his expression more subdued. "Let it go, man," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're just making yourself look worse." "Worse?" Greg snapped, shrugging off Kevin's hand. "No. I'm not letting this slide." He turned abruptly, storming toward the old man with determined strides. The crowd fell silent, the tension thickening again as they realized another confrontation was brewing. "Hey!" Greg's voice was sharp, cutting through the murmurs. The old man stopped but didn't turn, his shoulders square, his posture unshaken. "You think you can come here, disrespect us, and walk away like nothing happened?" Slowly, the old man turned to face Greg. His blue eyes, still sharp and unwavering, locked onto the younger man with a calm that only seemed to enrage him further. "Disrespect," the old man said evenly. "You're the one who wanted a show. I gave you one." Greg took another step forward, his fists tightening. "You didn't give us anything but a pile of crap about respect. Who even are you? Some washed-up has been looking for attention." The insult hung in the air, but the old man didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, his gaze unrelenting. "Mike Thompson," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of something undeniable. "That name mean anything to you?" The crowd fell into an uneasy silence. A ripple of recognition spread through the older members of the gathering, their eyes widening as they exchanged glances. Even Liz stiffened, her mind racing to connect the dots. It was Mark, one of the senior riders in the group, who finally broke the silence. "Wait," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. Mike Thompson, as in the highway ghost. The murmurs started again, louder this time, tinged with awe and curiosity. Liz's eyes narrowed, her focus sharpening as she stared at the man in front of her. The highway ghost, she repeated under her breath, the name stirring a memory from years ago. Greg looked confused, his anger momentarily dampened by the shift in the crowd's energy. "What the hell is a highway ghost?" he demanded. Mark stepped forward, his expression serious. Mike Thompson was a legend in the 80s. A highway patrol officer who could outride anyone, criminals, gangs, even other officers. There wasn't a chase he couldn't win. They called him the highway ghost because he'd appear out of nowhere and shut you down before you even knew what hit you. The weight of the revelation hit the crowd like a shockwave. Conversations erupted, some in disbelief, others in admiration. Greg's face twisted in defiance, unwilling to let go of his anger. "That's just a story," he scoffed. "Some old biker myth. You're telling me this guy's supposed to be a cop from decades ago? Look at him. He's a joke." But Mark wasn't swayed. "It's not a story," he said firmly. "I was there for one of his chases, back in my wilder days. He took down an entire gang on wheels without breaking a sweat. If he says he's Mike Thompson, then I believe him." The name spread through the crowd like wildfire, and the atmosphere shifted yet again. Admiration replaced skepticism, and the earlier jeers were now whispers of awe. Liz finally stepped forward, her sharp eyes fixed on Mike. "Why now?" she asked, her voice cutting through the noise. "Why show up here after all this time?" Mike's gaze softened slightly as he looked at Liz, recognizing her as someone who understood the gravity of the moment. "Because the road doesn't forget," he said. "And neither do I." The cryptic answer hung in the air, and Liz felt a flicker of understanding. There was more to this man than his reputation, something deeper, something unresolved. But before she could press further, Greg, still bristling, stepped between them. "This doesn't prove anything," he spat. "So, you've got some old nickname. Big deal. You're still just a washed-up relic trying to relive your glory days." Mike tilted his head, his expression almost pitying. "The only thing more dangerous than ignorance is arrogance," he said quietly. "I'd tread carefully, son. The road has a way of humbling those who forget their place." Greg's patience snapped. With a roar of frustration, he lunged forward, his fist swinging toward Mike in a wild punch. But Mike moved like the wind, effortless and precise. He sidestepped the blow and twisted Greg's arm behind his back in one fluid motion. Greg yelped in pain, his bravado crumbling as he was forced to his knees. "Respect isn't demanded," Mike said, his voice low and steady. "It's earned. And sometimes it's taught." He released Greg and stepped back, leaving the younger man to scramble to his feet, humiliated but unharmed. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their respect for Mike solidifying with every passing moment. Liz stepped closer to Mike, her expression softer now. "You've made your point," she said. "But I have a feeling this isn't just about teaching some bikers a lesson." Mike met her gaze, and for a moment, the weight of his past seemed to surface in his eyes. "No," he admitted. "It's not." The crowd watched as he turned and walked back to the Harley, his movements slower now, as if the night's events had taken their toll. Liz followed him, determined to uncover the truth behind the man who had just turned their world upside down. As Mike mounted the Harley and prepared to leave, he paused, looking back at Liz. "Sometimes," he said, "the road calls you back. Not for glory, but for closure." With that, he started the engine, the Harley roaring to life once more. He rode off into the night, leaving behind a parking lot full of questions and a newfound respect that would linger long after he was gone. The parking lot remained in stunned silence long after the sound of the Harley's engine faded into the night. Greg rubbed his wrist where Mike had restrained him, his bruised ego visible on his flushed face. Kevin stood a few paces behind, his arms crossed, his usual smirk absent as he stared at the empty space where Mike had been moments before. The crowd, unsure of what to do next, began to disperse in hushed groups, their excitement subdued by the evening's unexpected drama. Liz remained rooted in place, her mind racing. The name Mike Thompson lingered in her thoughts, stirring memories of whispered tales she had overheard as a young rider. The highway ghost wasn't just a legend, it was a symbol of respect, a testament to the kind of rider who lived and breathed the road. And now, that legend was here, flesh and blood, but with a weight to his presence that spoke of a story far more complex than anyone could imagine. "You think he's for real?" Kevin asked, breaking the silence as he stepped closer to Liz. His voice lacked its usual bravado, carrying a note of genuine curiosity. Liz turned her sharp gaze on him, her expression unreadable. "If Mark believes it, then it's real," she said simply. "The man rode circles around you too and didn't even break a sweat. You think that's luck?" Kevin hesitated but didn't argue. Greg, however, wasn't ready to let go of his anger. "I don't care who he is," he snapped. "He humiliated us. He thinks he's better than us just because he has some old nickname? Screw that." Liz sighed, shaking her head. "That's your problem, Greg. You think everything is about being better than someone else. Maybe if you listen for once, you'd actually learn something." Her words cut deep, and Greg glared at her but said nothing. Instead, he turned and stalked off toward his bike, muttering curses under his breath. Kevin lingered a moment longer before following, leaving Liz alone to contemplate the night's events. She glanced at her own Harley, the chrome reflecting the dim glow of the diner's neon lights. There was a weight in her chest, a nagging feeling that she couldn't shake. Something about Mike Thompson's presence felt unfinished, as if his sudden appearance was the prelude to something much larger. Without another word, she mounted her bike, her decision already made. The night air was cool against her face as she sped down the highway, her headlight cutting through the darkness. The town's outskirts quickly gave way to open road, the kind of terrain that stretched endlessly into the horizon. She followed the faint scent of gasoline and the phantom echo of Mike's Harley, trusting her instincts to guide her. It didn't take long to find him. He was parked at the edge of a deserted rest stop, the Harley's engine silent as he leaned against the bike, staring out at the expanse of black sky speckled with stars. Liz pulled up beside him, cutting her engine and dismounting. The crunch of gravel under her boots announced her arrival, but Mike didn't look at her. "You followed me," he said, his voice low but not surprised. Liz crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "You left too many questions back there," she said. "And I don't think you're the type to show up just to teach a couple of punks a lesson." Mike let out a quiet chuckle, the sound tinged with something deeper, weariness, perhaps, or regret. "You're sharp," he said, finally turning to face her. "Sharper than most." Liz stepped closer, her gaze steady. "Why now?" she asked. "Why show up after all these years? What are you looking for?" Mike sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. "Closure," he admitted. "I spent my life chasing criminals, riding harder and faster than anyone else. But when you live like that, the road has a way of catching up to you." Liz frowned, her curiosity deepening. "What happened?" For a moment, Mike was silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if searching for the right words. "Back in my prime, there was a gang," he began. "The Iron Fangs. They ran drugs, guns, you name it. They thought they owned the highways, and for a while, they did. Until I started chasing them down." He paused, his jaw tightening. "It was my greatest victory, and my biggest failure. I took down the gang, but in the process, I lost a friend. Another officer. We were chasing them at night, and he misjudged a turn. The crash was brutal." Liz's breath hitched. She had heard stories like this before, but hearing it from someone who had lived it made it all too real. "And you blame yourself?" Mike nodded slowly. "Every mile I ride, I see his face. I hear the crash. I keep wondering if I could have done something different. Maybe slowed down. Maybe stopped altogether." The weight of his confession hung between them, heavy and raw. Liz didn't know what to say, so she stayed silent, letting him continue. "When I heard about this place, about the road stallions," Mike said, "I thought maybe I could find some peace. Maybe being around riders again would remind me why I loved the road in the first place." Liz's expression softened, her respect for the man growing with every word. "And did it?" she asked quietly. Mike smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Not yet," he said. But tonight was a start. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the moment. Liz turned to see Greg and Kevin pulling into the rest stop, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Greg's expression was still sour, but Kevin looked more uncertain than angry. "What the hell are you doing out here?" Greg demanded as he dismounted, his tone still combative. Mike met Greg's glare with calm indifference. "Riding," he said simply. Greg scoffed. "You think this is over? You embarrassed me in front of everyone. You think I'm just gonna let that go?" Liz stepped between them, her voice sharp. "Greg, stop. This isn't about you anymore." Greg ignored her, his focus locked on Mike. "Prove it," he spat. "Prove you're as good as they say. 1-on-1. You and me." Mike sighed, his weariness evident, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes. Resolve, perhaps, or a sense of inevitability. He straightened, his posture solid as he met Greg's challenge head-on. "You want a race," Mike said. "Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you." Liz's stomach tightened as the tension mounted. She could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that what happened next would leave an indelible mark on all of them. The road waited, silent and unyielding. The night was heavy with silence, save for the faint rustle of the wind and the occasional creak of metal as the bikes settled into stillness. The highway stretched ahead like an open wound, black asphalt cutting through the landscape under the pale light of the moon. Mike stood motionless by his Harley, his figure outlined against the dark expanse, while Greg paced back and forth, his frustration crackling like static in the charged air. "Here's how this works," Greg said, his voice loud and brimming with defiance. "We take the highway to the old bridge, 7 miles straight, no shortcuts. First one across wins. Simple enough for you, old man." Mike didn't answer immediately. He ran his hand along the handlebar of his bike, his fingers brushing the cold metal with an almost reverent touch. Then he turned to Greg, his expression calm, unreadable. "I'm not racing to prove anything to you," he said. "But if it'll shut you up, fine." Liz stepped forward, her boots crunching on the gravel. "This is stupid," she said, her tone sharp as her gaze flicked between the two men. "Greg, you're not going to win this. You saw what he can do." Greg's jaw tightened. "Stay out of it, Liz. This isn't about you." "It's not about you either," Liz shot back. "This guy doesn't need to race you to prove he's better. We all know it." But Greg ignored her, already climbing onto his bike, the engine roaring to life beneath him. Kevin stood nearby, his arms crossed, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. Liz sighed, frustration and worry swirling in her chest. She turned to Mike, who had mounted his Harley and was adjusting his gloves. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. Mike met her gaze, his piercing blue eyes softening just enough to reveal a flicker of something deeper, gratitude, perhaps, or weariness. "It's not about him," he said simply. "It's about the road." And with that, he started his engine, the powerful growl cutting through the night like a war cry. Greg revved his bike in response, a sharp, almost frantic sound, as if trying to drown out the presence of the man he was so desperate to beat. The two riders lined up side by side, their headlights casting long beams down the empty stretch of highway. Liz stepped back, her heart pounding. The stakes felt larger than the race itself, as if the stretch of road ahead wasn't just a physical challenge but a test of something intangible. She clenched her fists, torn between her instinct to stop them and her understanding that this moment was already beyond her control. Kevin raised his arm, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. "On my count," he said reluctantly. 3, 2, 1, go." The roar of engines shattered the stillness as both bikes shot forward, their taillights disappearing into the dark. The crowd that had begun to gather around the rest stopped, watched in stunned silence, the weight of the moment rendering them speechless. Liz stood at the edge of the gravel lot, her eyes fixed on the road, the tension in her chest growing with every passing second. Out on the highway, the two bikes raced side by side, their engines screaming in unison. Greg leaned forward, gripping the handlebars so tightly his knuckles turned white. The adrenaline coursing through his veins blurred everything else: the scenery, the cold night air, even the memory of Mike's earlier display of skill. All he could focus on was the road and the man beside him. But Mike was different. His movements were smooth, unhurried, his posture relaxed as he navigated the highway with the precision of someone who had lived on it his entire life. The Harley wasn't just a machine beneath him, it was an extension of his body, responding to his every thought, his every instinct. Where Greg rode with desperation, Mike rode with purpose. The old bridge came into view, its rusted steel frame illuminated by the moonlight. Greg pushed harder, his bike inching ahead, the speedometer needle climbing dangerously close to its limit. He glanced over at Mike, expecting to see some sign of struggle, some hint of exertion. But Mike's expression was calm, almost serene, his focus unwavering. As the bridge loomed closer, the road narrowed, forcing both riders into a tight lane. Greg gritted his teeth, refusing to let up, even as the wind whipped against his face like needles. He was going to win this. He had to. Then it happened. A sudden curve in the road. Sharp, unexpected. Greg's bike wobbled, the front tire skidding as he struggled to regain control. His heart leapt into his throat, panic flooding his senses. For a split second, it seemed inevitable that he would lose control completely, that the bike would crash and take him with it. But then Mike was there. In one fluid motion, Mike leaned his Harley toward Greg's bike, nudging it just enough to stabilize the wobbling front tire. The maneuver was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Greg regained control, his bike straightening out just as they reached the bridge. For a moment, Greg was too stunned to react. He glanced over at Mike, who hadn't even looked at him, his focus still locked on the road ahead. It wasn't until they crossed the bridge, Mike ahead by only a few feet, that Greg finally understood what had happened. The bike slowed, their engines rumbling as the riders pulled to a stop at the far end of the bridge. Greg dismounted, his legs shaky, his chest heaving with the effort of catching his breath. Mike climbed off his Harley with the same calm precision he had shown all night, his boots landing softly on the asphalt. "You," Greg began, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard, his emotions warring between anger and something he didn't want to name, gratitude. "Why did you?" Mike turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Because that's what riders do," he said simply. "We look out for each other. Even the ones who don't deserve it." Greg's shoulders slumped, the weight of the words hitting him harder than any crash ever could. He looked down at the ground, unable to meet Mike's gaze. Behind them, Liz and Kevin arrived, their bikes slowing to a stop. Liz dismounted quickly, her eyes scanning both men for any sign of injury. When she saw that they were unharmed, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Mike nodded, his gaze shifting to Liz. "Better than most nights," he said. Greg didn't speak. He climbed back onto his bike and rode off without another word, the sound of his engine fading into the distance. Liz watched him go, her expression a mix of frustration and relief. Mike turned to her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "The road has a way of teaching its own lessons," he said. Liz nodded, her respect for the man now fully solidified. "You coming back to the diner?" she asked. Mike glanced at the highway stretching out before him. "Not tonight," he said. "But I'll be around. The road isn't done with me yet." With that, he mounted his Harley and rode off into the night, leaving behind the faint scent of gasoline and the memory of a lesson no one would soon forget. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.